Welcome to the Fatality Free Future podcast. I'm John Barclay.
My name is Holly Ferguson. This is the podcast where we explore the challenges and possibilities of creating a fatality-free future. Today, we're welcoming James Cooper onto the podcast. Welcome.
Thanks very much, Holly. Thanks for inviting me.
I'd like to give everyone a bit of a background into who you are. You've got an extensive international management experience in the resource industry, leading diverse teams across HR, organisational development, finance and commercial functions. You are passionate about driving organisational effectiveness, specialising in cultural transformation, leadership development and change management. And you've got expertise in organisational health, coaching and business strategy. Currently, you partner with organisations to deliver people-focused outcomes and sustainable success. A lot in there. James, what brought you into the world of HR and where you are today?
Yeah, Holly, it's been a fairly long career. I spent 3.5 decades working in the mining industry across 2 continents, as you say, with a variety of teams and disciplines. The actual working has been mostly on site, so part of management teams on site, both FIFO, residential, across various commodities. I'm originally qualified as a chartered accountant and a CPA, so I haven't had a traditional sort of pathway through to HR or organisational development, and I'm probably a slow learner, you know. It took me probably 10 years to realise, and this was when I first sort of hit management team level, that business is really a people game. And I could probably make a bigger difference to people and organisations through organisational development, stroke HR, than in my sort of finance and commercial roles. And it certainly became my passion. And I was fortunate enough to be able to couple it with advancing, doing MBAs and things like that, just to complement my experience and actually use it. So invaluable.
I'm very curious. I actually don't know this. How do you two know each other?
Well, I guess it goes into a little bit of the conversation we want to get into today. I mean, I was working for a client that James was working for, and we're there to do some leadership development and safety leadership work, and I know how important it is to work with the human resources, organisational development side of the business. So we started to connect pretty much day one of that planning around what that's going to look like and how we're going to move forward from there. So learnt a lot together through that process, and hence why I think it's great that we get a chance to talk through some of that today.
That's exactly right. We want to talk about partnership and alignment between HR and safety because, you know, they can be seen as quite different departments, different areas, but there are a lot of similarities and commonalities between the two. What would you say are some of those?
Holly, like you say, there's quite regularly organisations regard the sort of safety and HR as different silos or streams, whereas there's just so much in common, and in particular there's a shared outcome of, you know, people's well-being and people's safety, and trying to equip the organisation and actually can create the environment that can fulfil all of that.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental thing both functions have in common is it's, you know, the organisation is successful based on its people. You know, so HR is all about people and the people in the business, and safety is about protecting people and business. So those two have exactly the same common purpose of the well-being and the success of people in the business.
Across the country, we've had new legislation come into effect in the health and safety space. And in particular, we've got new psychosocial legislation, and that has brought a new awareness around the integration between HR and safety. Why do you both think that is?
I mean, when you think about previous legislation around fair work and all those sorts of things, there's always been an element around the way we treat people at work. But now it's been not just sitting in human resources legislation, now sitting in safety-specific legislation. What's your perspective on why that transitioned into that space?
I think it's the mere fact that if you're talking someone's safety, it's got to be physical as well as psychological. More mature organisations have actually, I think, identified the opportunity to bring the two functions closer to one another in terms of collaboration and overlap based on that shared outcome. The irony around some of it is a lot of this is based on compliance. Companies are being forced to actually do this. And if you look at both sort of functions of health and safety as well as HR, the maturity curve, for want of a better term, is really around moving from providing a service to providing support to enabling and then partnering. And this is actually part of the journey. What I have found as well with the more mature organisations is that they will probably focus more at the higher level of things. Give you an example, in an HR world, you have to tell people about bullying, harassment, discrimination, sexual assault. That's all down sort of the terrible level of that continuum, but focusing more on sort of respectful behaviours and those type of things that you want people to exhibit. It sort of pulls everything with it, and it's examining that. It's far more positive. And I think there's sort of a realisation, albeit it's got to start with an awareness. And now they're exploring it more and more.
My first experience to any of this was in the early 90s when I first started my career, where they were talking us through bullying and harassment in the workplace. They were talking through sexual harassment in the workplace and appropriate behaviours in the workplace. So it's not like it's new, like it's been in organisational requirements for a long time. But I think, as you said, it's now gotten a lot more focused in on that actually being a compliance orientated process, not just from an organisational fair treatment process, but actually a safety perspective as well.
Yeah, it's definitely elevated the other side of the sort of the OD world, that culture is so important. Your systems need to support the behaviours you want to drive, that whole aspect. So it's become more integrated as a result, which should bring, again, back to the sort of shared outcomes happening a bit more.
And I think it goes to your original question, Holly, is, what's the two functions got in common? We talked people, but actually one of the key things we started with was driving the right culture, right? There was a safety. We talk about it all the time in our podcasts and in our work with clients. It's just how, culture is an absolute critical aspect of how things go successfully. And, we always use the term culture eats systems for breakfast, right? So if you have really good systems, culture's still going to eat that. So there is still this need for both HR, OD, organisational development, as well as safety, working together on that cultural journey to make sure that they're actually getting the right outcomes, because it is in that psychosocial risk space, but it's also just in the general performance of the business and the team's space as well.
Mm. And when we do silo HR and safety, there are some risks that come with that, particularly around procedural fairness.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Holly. A lot of this is all based on trust. When we think trust, I certainly immediately, and through the work that we did, John, it was working on the trust between individuals, really important. But you forget that the organisation has got a big part to play in this, in terms of their policies and procedures. And procedural fairness is actually the link. People actually want to know, and quite regularly they just don't know, that they'll be treated fairly through the systems. So you need to have frameworks that actually support and are visible and transparent. And I think, again, over the years, this is developed. We've seen whistleblower facilities and such, but it goes further than that.
That's the whole partnering opportunity here. When the two functions don't partner, then they can actually unintentionally work against each other. And safety, and we've talked about this as well, can quite quickly go down heavy compliance, heavy blame type situations based on the way safety's been performed. And if there's not support, guidance, partnering with HR, those processes can be actually against fair work standards that you're trying to do as a organisation anyway. So those two needs have to keep coming together, because that's where procedural justice is going to have to come from. They're going to have to be working together on how do we work through situations where we have people doing, or we have groups of people doing, or we have an outcome that we don't want, and we need to be able to have the procedurally fair process to doing that. So good policies, good procedures, but good consistent application of how we actually manage those things on an ongoing basis. Going back to what James said there, the work we're doing together, we did so much work initially just around building trust with each other, being trustworthy and having trust, and working through some team-orientated work around above the line, below the line behaviours, and getting into the conversation around what's acceptable around here, and really building that trust amongst each other. But all of that can fall over pretty quickly if the organisation isn't reinforcing those things in a very constructive way.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that focus was on leadership, which is, what does happen and needs to, so that the role modelling happens and such. But there was an element of having to make sure that operators and maintainers and such people doing the real work okay, actually did participate and understood and actually felt that they could trust the organisation. Quite often we spend too long on outcomes of disciplinary action rather than how we're going to improve and how we're going to create that safe environment. There are mechanisms to do that, the rights of appeal and things like that. That's what procedural fairness is about. And the organisation has a part to play there because they need those frameworks in place, and they need to let people know that they do exist and then demonstrate them so people can see them being used.
And that then can potentially lead to the other problem when there's not good partnering here and we're working in silos is we talk from a safety perspective. If there's a safety issue, you go to the safety department. If there's a people issue, go to the HR department, when actually the leader and the team themselves have an element of responsibility and accountability to manage most of those things day in and day out. Because if there's an issue over there from a safety perspective, they want to call up the safety person to go deal with it, when actually that's actually within your remit as a team and a leader to work through that. You need the right tools and the right processes to do that.
And the right coaching.
Yeah, correct.
That's, whether it's internal or external. Yeah, and it's got to be consistent.
So how would we encourage leaders to start working collaboratively between HR and safety?
Yeah, very good question. Some of it is actually defining what you mean by collaboration and what it looks like. And quite often it's around teamwork. So you have to be very clear as to what the expectations are. And it isn't just across the safety field, it's across collaboration and whether you're talking maintenance and operations, technical, there has to be a dependency on one another to actually have a shared outcome of something better. And in this case, it's the safety side of things. So making those expectations quite clear around what good collaboration looks like. And generally speaking, that's what good team membership looks like, in terms of a teamwork model, because it's more than an expectation. We use the word accountability. And it is that. It's really interesting because a lot of the folk that I deal with have been highly technical, whether they're engineers, accountants and such. And if you can give them some form of structure to sort of hang their hat on, that's a starting point. So you can actually try and describe what social process is going to look like. And once they grasp that, it's a starting point. And then they'll realise that some of it has to be adaptive. But it gives a ground level of a starting point for them to sort of try and collaborate with one another. And their particular leader, the next up leader, needs to be fully engaged with it as well.
You just touched on it in the last point, is it's just around the coaching of leaders, around partnering with other subject matter expertise in the business, not feeling like they have to isolate themselves from support. One thing, and two, it's not handballing things to other departments either. It's actually working with, knowing who your role is, knowing what your role is, knowing who you're accountable for and what you're accountable for, but know where your support is. And I think that's the part, like I say, you got to define that collaboration. You got to sort of define that social fabric. So if I'm a operations supervisor or a maintenance supervisor, I've got the responsibility and the accountabilities as a leader of a team, but I have support. I have support with HR to help me understand the procedural fairness, help me understand the organisational needs and requirements. I have my safety function who can give me advice around good risk management, good risk processes and those sorts of things. And again, there's others. You can lean into IT, you can lean into engineering, you can lean into technical. So it's just knowing where your support network is and seeing them as a support network, not I've got a people problem, so I give that to HR. I've got a safety problem, I'll give that to safety. It's actually learning that altogether is a partnership. And I think it goes to senior leaders having that vision and understanding to start with and be able to cascade that down so everyone really understands how that work goes. And I think there are people who are in roles that have to make a deliberate effort to, if I'm going to do some consultation or collaboration with departments, I need to think about who else, not just the department, who else needs to come in. I know one of the activities we did when we were on site doing this work was a typical team day for a department, and it was very quickly I was trying to influence the leader of that department to go, it's not just your team. Who else do you need in the room? Well, I need engineers represented in the room. I need HR I need safety represented. So it went from just them and their team to now going, well, this is actually my team because I've got to work with all these other people for my team to function. And I can remember at the end of that day, quite a few people just thanking that leader for them being present, because they don't ever get invited to a team planning day to plan on how we're going to be successful. Now all those support functions know what this team's trying to achieve and how they can support it.
Yeah, it was really interesting because we built things into people's routines as well, so that they could demonstrate that they were actually collaborating, and that was quite empowering for them, because they could use common language and describe how they'd solved a problem collaboratively. And that was massive for them to be able to demonstrate and manage upwards. And it led to improvements.
What John was speaking about there, that was, I suppose, someone with more of a safety role stepping in and saying, okay, I know I need to collaborate with different departments. James, for HR professionals, if we've got any listening, this is maybe not quite their domain, what's your advice to them about reaching out and doing their part to create that relationship with other departments and with safety departments?
Yeah, I think it's starting with a shared outcome. So identify that in the first instance. And safety is just such an obvious one, albeit different organisations are in a different maturity phase. But you're right, it goes across even within a sort of an HR department. Quite often you'll find that there are silos set up between corporate and operations, or organisational development and recruitment, and your traditional HR streams. So it's sort of internal as well as external, department-wise, silo-wise.
I think the whole senior leadership team has a responsibility here to bring the organisation as a whole together to be working towards the common goal, not going off in isolations and everyone having their individual goals that aren't aligned to an overarching organisational goal. There's so much more in common in quite a few things the organisation has to do. So the way we recruit people, the way we onboard people, the way we develop people, the way we performance manage people, HR, safety, engineering, maintenance, ops, all these, they all have a common purpose in all of that. And what we unfortunately do is we separate them all, and they all sit in isolation of each other. And for the individual, they feel like they're getting pulled from pillar to post in that process, where if they came together and said, okay, we've got a common goal, common purpose, so let's make sure our recruitment strategy is aligned to that, make sure our professional development's aligned to that, and then the individual feels like there's actually a common pathway here that I'm working towards, and I'm getting supported in that, not getting pulled all over the place for different reasons.
Yeah, and some of that's preventative, if you like. You put a safety lens across it. A lot of that is sort of your preventative aspects, so you're not introducing hazards, so the right people doing the right job at the right time, all of those real basic things that you need to get right, all of that should feed into the common goal of people's well-being and safety being well looked after.
Yeah, and I think from a serious injury and fatality prevention, we talk about these weak signals in an organisation, and most of the time we've spoken about that very deliberately in the safety realm, but I think there's a broader organisational context that lead to weak signals that we've been talking about today, that is a combination of HR and safety that can both enable that and sustain that process.
Wrapping up, guys, I'd love to know if you both have some tips for either safety professionals or HR professionals. What are a few things they could do ideally today to start bettering those relationships, to getting, their cross departments to really start working together? How would you go about that?
Shall I go first, John?
Go on.
All right, okay. I think it's being able to look at whatever you're looking at through the other person's lens. Okay, it's suspend your judgment and actively listen to get their point of view. Sitting in a coaching sense, quite often I talk about a fact has no meaning. So ask people what actually gives a fact meaning, and it's a point of view. But a point of view, of course, as you well know, can be from a different direction. So that single fact, and people dwell on facts, but remember, different points of view give different meaning to those facts. So suspend your own belief system and your judgment to actually listen really actively from the other person's point of view.
I like that. I mean, we talk about that as humility, right? And being able to, that empathy and humility part of our role. So I quite like that, and I think that's probably the most important thing. From my point of view, I think depending on what role you're in, is just asking yourself, whenever you're building a HR policy or process, what are the potential safety implications of that? And if you're creating a safety process or a safety system, how can HR or OD actually help sustain that process? Because I think I'll always talk about this in regards to this. I'm talking now specifically to safety. The safety function is an enabler. Mm-hmm. So they're creating a process or a system to enable good risk management. The HR function is the sustainer. They're the ones creating the organisational structures, processes and systems in relation to the organisation to sustain those things. So if you're a safety person listening to this, you need to be thinking about, how do I work with HR to get whatever it is I'm trying to achieve in the business to be sustainable?
And if we get to a point where there is good collaboration, what wonderful benefits does that bring?
People will be safer.
Yeah.
Well put.
People will be safer and there'll be greater wellbeing at work.
Thank you, James, for joining us on the Fatality Free Future podcast.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, James.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Fatality Free Future podcast. Head to our Fatality Free Future hub on barclays.com for more information and to access everything we spoke about in this episode.